we're looking at one of my favorite weapon types. It's an antique, of course. A beautiful old Kris. So a pretty typical video for the channel, but I am going to spice it up a bit by making this a response to Matt from Scala Gladiatoria, who is as good as it gets when it comes to YouTube weapons creators, but left out something that I think you can't leave out. And the thing is, he is most definitely not alone. And that's why I'm kind of specifically responding to like 7-year-old videos. That's when he made those. Although he has made some recent ones where he pulls out the Kris. But first, the weapon. The Kris, K-R-I-S, or keris, K-E-R-I-S, is one of the more unusual dagger and sword types from around the world. This slow pan of the one that I got to see certainly gives you an indication of that. And that's in regard to far more than just the wavy shape that this one features. They're presumed to have originated from the island of Java, which is center bottom of the picture here as we scroll up. And the thing you'll notice about the map is how densely packed this area is with other islands, nations, peoples. The Kris ended up spreading to many of them, all the way to the Philippines, Cambodia, and even Thailand, which is just starting to come on screen. The evolution of the keris can be seen in temple carvings, and it basically goes along the lines of a early Indian-inspired leaf-shaped blade, turning into what's considered kind of a proto-keris around the 9th, 10th century, and then during the Majapahit Empire, I hope I got that semi-correct, the keris really took form, and it was that empire that then spread it out to other lands. That was in the 14th century. And as you can imagine, as is natural enough, the weapon was changed. It evolved into different forms in various places. But you can see the shared DNA from small to large, plain to extravagant, and straight to semi-wavy throughout, very wavy throughout, or wavy in one part and straight in another. The name Kris is generally used to apply to both the dagger and sword length variations. Speaking of blade length, no, that is not a functional fighting Kris, but I bet this type here is a surprise to many of you. Now let's deal with the main components that comprise this weapon. Those are blade, guard, hilt, and scabbard. Don't be fooled by this picture. The name of the blade is not Luke. That's the name of the undulations on the blade when it's wavy. So anyway, what is the overall blade called? Generally either Wila, W-I-L-A-H, or Bila, so very similar words, right? And everything we're looking at here is basically made of two pieces. What we would call the blade and the tang, that's one-piece construction. And yes, the tang is what we would call a rat tail in design. So no, the method of securement to the hilt is not as robust as it could be with these. It's said they could eventually loosen to the point where they even spun in place or somewhat. Connecting the dots here, I think that's why I read more than once about pinching the guard or maybe the very base of the blade was a fighting grip. But anyway, the second piece is what passes for a guard with this design. And notice the label ganja really close to the tang, and it points out the part that we're talking about here. That is made separately and has a hole for the tang to go through. And as you'll see, as I continue to zoom out with this image, there are a lot of individual features with a lot of individual names. And now to the hilt, usually called a hulu, appears to always have symbolic carving and often, but not always, a pistol grip shape. Usually made of wood or mostly of wood, like the scabbards. And as you can tell by the shortness, this is always a one-handed weapon. Sticking to the big picture then, we move on to the scabbard. Most sources call it a waranka, W-A-R-A-N, waran, G-K-A, and you'll notice the most notable part of the scabbard in this illustration, and the most notable part that they always feature, is called something very similar. It's really just a shortened version of the word I just went through. See that there? And so is it that the name of the most notable part also applies to the overall object, and both spellings are valid? Are they two different terms? I can't tell you. From a martial arts perspective, there's something that gets skipped a lot, something important. It is also a weapon of sorts, a defensive one. This is described as a common practice, like if you've got only your keris to defend yourself with, then you're absolutely going to take it, put it in your dominant hand, but put the scabbard in your non-dominant hand. Like with pretty much all weapons from around the world, the fancier the specimen is, the less likely it was ever intended for combative use. And just compare this scabbard here to the last two I showed. The blades are a subject that you could do an entire half-hour video or hour video on in and of themselves, so before we get to them, let's talk about the names for the overall weapon and its many variants. Kris or keris are both acceptable. Here's a page from a Malaysian art dealer that focuses exclusively on these, and they only use the term keris, for instance. And they even break down the etymology, at least in Malay terms. Oxford University, no slouches when it comes to language, they use keris and then only mention on the side, pronounced and sometimes spelt as Kris. And as you'll see in this video, there are serious academic papers that stick to the word keris. My point is not that keris is more correct than Kris, just that it seems keris is at least as proper as Kris, and that's why I like to use both. Sticking to the basic, kerises are always described as asymmetrical because they are. Whether they're wavy or straight, it's the base of the blade that makes them asymmetrical, as you can see with this straight example here. When it comes to the rest of the blade up above that part, sometimes it's symmetrical and sometimes it's not, but I think it's safe to say it usually is. They're almost always described as thrusting weapons, and you can see why with this example here. And yes, by the way, we've made it to talking about the blades. Well, you've no doubt picked up on the fact that kerises are generally divided into straight versus wavy, but then there's examples like this that blur the lines. We'd call this straight in terms of those broad classifications, even though it's actually a little bit curved. Now, we already know the hilts are often pistol grip shaped. When present, does that indicate the direction you would normally swing the weapon with on a slash? Because if so, on this specimen here, you're going to see as we get to the bottom, then you would swing it more like a sickle than a saber, meaning with the concave side. For a basic cut, but they are double-edged. Regardless, that means the longer part of the crosspiece goes to the back side of your hand and not the front. And I've seen that as the orthodox hold. And they almost always seem to be constructed that way, so the elongated bit protects the top of the hand, like the back. And see this one here? It's set up in the opposite manner. That is a rarity. The shortness and shape of the hilts, that's conducive to a thrust, but slashing techniques are used with this weapon. Now let's talk about the calling card of the blades. No, not the wavy shape, because we know that's not always present. This look comes about by combining iron with nickel, and you combine the two through pattern welding. A smith who makes a kris is an empu, E-M-P-U. The patterning can be purposely abstract or a predetermined pattern, and even, it's said, a representation of specific objects or letters. I'm really going to get out of my depths here, but keris blades, at least some, have a rough texture, like the antique I own, not the one I'm showing today, definitely has that. And in fact, I remember reading, many years ago, so I don't remember what source. Anyway, I remember reading about how outsiders would sometimes acquire one of these and then basically ruin it by trying to polish the blade. But I think this doesn't apply to all krises of the dagger variety, and I know it doesn't to all of them of the sword variety, because the one I own, again, it's gritty to the touch, and it doesn't look like this one or the next one. I could picture someone in their ignorance acquiring it and say, I gotta get this grit off of this blade, but I can't imagine them doing that with this one here, for instance. Now, of all the readings I've done over the years, but especially in preparation for this video, I only found one source in this refresh that I did about how krises can be made, the blades, in one of two different ways, one of them being simpler, and I think the one I own must be of that kind. But regardless, what we're looking at here is the more classic, famous, appreciated way. And when that is the method, substances are used to bring out the contrast in these layers, the iron versus the nickel. The last picture you saw the nickel being prepared. Here it's being inserted into the iron. In the classic method, by the way, you end up with three metals, really, because it's steel, iron, and nickel. And traditionally, the nickel was from fallen meteors. And that was important because there was a whole cosmological philosophy around this, where you're incorporating the different elements from the earth, but also from the sky. And they had other ways to justify explain how the other elements were pulled in. So basically it was, earth, air, fire, and water. For the classic two-tone appearance, acid etching was done to the blade with citric acid and arsenic. According to the spokesman during this video, he said that prior to that, they get treated with sulfur and salt in kind of a muddy mixture. But speaking of the arsenic, That's a good segue for talking about an important piece of the lore, anyway, and that's that this weapon is said to be poisoned. Now, I use the word lore for a reason. You know, some indigenous weapons, we don't have to wonder, oh yeah, no, they absolutely poison these things, and here's how they do it, here's the poison they use. As far as I can tell, we don't have that when it comes to these. Could the use of arsenic, you know, the base ingredient in many poisons, on some keris types have led to this whole belief? Maybe. But I've been told directly by someone who practices Indonesian martial arts that the blades were poisoned by the owners, so in post-production, if you will. But I don't know if that means, you know, surely not all the time. Is that when you knew you're going into battle? I don't know. And that's even if we take this concept at face value. I've transitioned images here to a very handy visual showing from left to right the evolution of the keris. First you have the leaf-shaped ancestor, then the proto-keris, then third, you finally get something recognizable. That's a transitional one, and the evolution into, I guess you'd call, a true keris. And you can see how these really moved away from chop and slash friendly blades to more thrust friendly ones. But even with this evolutionary process, we know there are some keris variants that survived, which are broad bladed. Especially, but not exclusively, when it comes to the sword length variety. And that is nowhere so true as in the Philippines with the Moro, M-O-R-O, keris. And these are beastly, a very notable variant of the keris that shows how wide-ranging the family is. I'm definitely no expert, but it seems like you never see a Moro keris with the alternating two-tone pattern that we talked about earlier. And a lot of the examples, including I have seen these in person too, seem to prefer the more expected from us, shiny gleam to the surface of the blade, so I guess they preferred that. Speaking of the Moro are a Muslim and ethnic minority in the Philippines, with a centuries-long history of aggressively fighting off invaders and occupiers. Several of the people in this photo are armed, and it is not difficult at all to find the Moro keris in evidence. Remember earlier we talked about kerises that are meant to be seen but not used. We can definitely say that one about this one here. Why? Because it was a gift from a king to a U.S. president. This was a gift during the Obama administration. And it is a really good opportunity to talk about the straight versus wavy aspect. You're giving a present to the most powerful person in the world, you want to make it a good one. I think outsiders like us might assume a wavy keris is more prestigious than a straight one. I don't think that's the case, or I certainly don't think it's that simple. Again, you're a king giving a present to a president, it's probably going to be a top-of-the-line model, right? Look at the close-up of the handle. Also, check out the surface of the blade and the crosspiece. So we can say a prestige version doesn't necessarily have the clear two-tone pattern either. Like, I actually think this looks better. I love that look. Let's return to the thought about very high-end models featuring straight blades. And my observation, from the outside looking in, that it seems like either kind, wavy or straight, can be as expensive as it gets. In other words, as highly valued. To that point, these next three pictures show precious metals and jewels being used with straight blades. One thing we can say for certain is that the weapon was straight originally. It was only later that the curves were introduced, and they did become popular and are popular today, but both coexist. Keris is not curvy by definition, and prestige versions are made in both varieties. But when present, do the curves serve an actual function? That leads into my response to Matt, and his very colonizer take on the weapon, appropriate for a Brit. I'm teasing. Matt, like he'll ever see this. I'm Latino, I'm a person of color, but I have way more colonizer blood in my veins than you do. I'm literally related to Hernan Cortez. Also to the main guy, or one of the main guys who took down the Inca. I can't remember the name off the top of my head. And even have ancestors, at least one, that went to the trouble to put the word conquistador in their name. Oh, that actually reminds me of Matt's family history videos, but I'm not responding to that. Now, Matt only has a small handful of videos that are either about the keris or touch on it to a significant degree. And yeah, his main videos, like this one here on the topic, were years ago, but even in recent months, him and Skull focused on them, at least to a certain degree. And I only recently got to hold a real typical example, hence the timing. But anyway, if somebody just wants to learn about this kind of weapon, or even just trips over this video here, I think the impression they're going to get is, okay, I'm going to learn all the basics. And this person might not even be an expert, but I'm not going to walk away missing something that is headline worthy. You know, YouTube and the internet, it's full of people teaching about something that they're not experts in, and that's okay. I do it all the time. I did it in my second to last video. It's about construction and archaeology, neither of those being one of my areas of expertise. And in Matt's video, he is very upfront right off the bat, within like the first minute. Hey, I'm not an expert in these, not even in weapons from this part of the world. So that is very cool. But again, I think the problem is somebody could walk away from that video or others like it on this weapon and think, well, at least I know the basics now, and be missing a huge piece of the picture. Matt, in all of his videos where he touches on these weapons, shows and really focuses on the full sword version and of the, classically Filipino variety. But he also talks about the overall weapons family. Man, this is admittedly pedantic, but I do think a layman could walk away with the wrong impression in certain respects. Like the quote-unquote Kris sword is a mainstay of Southeast Asia, and that those swords look like the ones that he holds up a lot in the videos. I think a better impression to leave people with is the fact that the Kris is definitely a mainstay in Southeast Asia, and that Kris swords are a notable variant, and that the kind he shows in his videos are an even more particular variant. You'd probably also walk away, if you didn't know better, thinking that Filipino martial arts are the only ones that teach the use of the Kris and or Kris sword, when, that's not the case. And in fact, Salat, the Indonesian martial art, is the art that features the keris probably more than any other. Now, this gets confused because of which type of keris, but then that's a problem too when you're featuring the Moro Kris pretty much exclusively, if not exclusively. But at times you talk about the Kris overall. And even if you're restricting yourself to Kris swords, or again, that line is blurry, but for instance, this one here, would we classify it as a Kris sword? Well, I think we'd have to. But you'd walk away not even knowing that this kind of thing exists. But on to the missing headlines. At least touch on how unique the blade composition is. I mean, you're talking about the weapon type in general, certainly at points, so get some of that in there, and I'm not a big geek when it comes to that side of things, but I think it's very noteworthy for this weapon. Now for the really, really big one, and I mean this. You are not just looking at a weapon here. In terms of the traditional mindset, and this is so fascinating to me, with certain ethnographic fighting tools, like the Azmat shields that I've made a video on in the past. Anyway, you are looking at a truly functional, magical object. This is, many times, was used as a fighting knife, no doubt, but it also is the equivalent of like the lamp that contains the genie. I mean, it was thought to physically house a spirit, and that spirit could be one with good or bad intentions, so you had to be careful. And it could be used to kind of emanate those powers out and cause real-world effects, right? This is what was believed. So, and I don't mean this in a trite way at all, you're also looking at like a magic wand. So it's the lamp, that holds the jinn. It's a magic wand. It can kind of cast out its power. So how cool is that? The man we're looking at here, he said he fasts for 3 days, eating nothing but rice and drinking nothing but water before making a Kris. Yes, he's an empu. He's going to great lengths, 3 days, to religiously purify himself to help ensure that the Kris comes out as it should. On a spiritual level, this empu and his entire family are, in his words, praying to the gods prior to embarking on a Kris making. And that's how seriously at least some people still take this kind of thing to this day. So can you imagine what it was like centuries ago? I'm showing this picture on the highlights I put on it just to corroborate that this kind of belief made it with the spread of the Kris all the way up to the Moro. To that point, I'm just going to read a few quick excerpts from a paper from the University of the Philippines. It's an undergrad paper, but still. Quote, "The Moro Kris is said to have been from the gods. More than a mere weapon, it became an important indicator of man's standing and authority within Muslim Filipino society. The Kris served as the guardian of his culture and manhood, and was his protective talisman. Indeed, it was considered part of his very identity. The higher number of waves meant the more potent the Kris was in talismanic power." I'm showing this picture for a reason, and this is where our modern and Western mindset, it's the colonizer joke, it's just a joke of course, but with that mindset, without at least trying, and all we can do is try, but without at least trying to get to the mindset of the people who actually made and used these, we can skip right over what is probably the main reason for instance, and here's the reason for the picture, having a wavy blade. And I know they focus on wavy blades from around the world in this video, Matt and Skull, but even when they were focusing on the Kris, it's through a utilitarian lens. Is this, does it help with push cuts, pull cuts? Is it so they can't grab the blade? Does it make a puncture wound more effective, etc.? And all of those are valid considerations, but it's approaching this from the angle of, okay, it's wavy. What is the practical reason for that design? With the Kris, it's the precise opposite. It was very likely made wavy for cultural reasons first. And in this video and the others, cultural, religious reasons, or even the possibility of them, just get the slightest of passing mentions. Even as just a possibility or probability. Like, there's probably something like that had to do with it too. And that's if they're mentioned at all. Marcus Vance is a very successful sword blade YouTuber. Like Matt, knows more about swords than I do. But he made a short about, hey, let me explain to you why some blades are wavy. And then, of course, it's nothing but, physics-based reasons. And the thing is, he chooses to highlight a keris in that short. And in fact, let's talk about that one. Like, look at this Kris. Do you think this was ever designed for actual fighting, this one here? Because I don't. Hey, I should probably get back to showing the one I actually got to hold. But anyway, I saw one Empu, I think from Java, but I don't remember. I watched so many videos talking in translation about how the number of waves correspond to the birthday of the owner. Multiple sources say they're always odd in number, and there are specific connotations to the individual numbers, like 3 versus 5 versus 7. Anyway, back to our Smith. The thing is, he brought up no fighting applications. And even if these are modern times, so they barely ever fight with these anymore, we're still talking about, a maker of these in the traditional manner in one of the indigenous cultures that has used these for centuries and made them. Whenever you look for explanations for the waves in the blade from that part of the world, of course I'm restricted to translated materials, things that are in English and Spanish, but it seems to always be non-utilitarian. For instance, quote, in Bali, the Kris is associated with the dragon and water. The waves in the blade symbolize the movement of the serpent, end quote. And of course by serpent, they mean dragon, not snake. Well, what about snakes? Here's a different source. Quote, one of the uniqueness... It's, translated as best they could. All right. One of the uniqueness of the keris is its connection with the serpent, or naga. A Chinese monk who lived in Java during the late 7th century noticed the local Buddhism possessed a unique characteristic, praying naga deities. According to the tradition, the straight keris represents a still serpent, whereas the wavy represents a moving serpent. The naga is often represented on keris blades, end quote. The spiritual beliefs around the keris have been very fungible because later they had to incorporate, or they did incorporate, cultural beliefs and ideas as Islam was introduced into the region. But that is just the tip of the iceberg. There are whole academic papers dedicated to how the shape of the keris, the different shapes, different parts of the shapes were based on different belief systems, which ones were predominant at the time, because you had original native beliefs, spiritual beliefs, then the organized religions, way more than one coming in. Gods, a mythical mountain, the number of levels allowed in funerary structures, societal hierarchy tiers. Bottom line is, the shape of the keris appears to have always been driven by a symbolist and not a pragmatist perspective. Here's something that will probably surprise you. I can't remember if this was in Malaysia or, Java or where, but in this making of video, this is a woman, it's hard to tell from the video, she takes 2 kerises that they're making, presses them up against her body, points first, and goes through this, religious ecstasy ritual. And that's part of, again, making sure this thing comes out spiritually correct and beneficial as opposed to detrimental. This is clearly not some vestigial ritual that we're just honoring in some hollow way. No, this is intense. How culturally important are these in this part of the world? Well, UNESCO, the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, and they officially put the Kris on their list of, and this is a big deal, the list of the masterpieces of the oral and intangible heritage of humanity. They give some stats about how much variety there is in the overall keris family, and I've seen some counter stats. Let me just give you the ranges that I saw. Blade design, 40 to 60 variants. Pamor, 120 to 250 variants. Pamor means the pattern on the blade. I've now kind of dovetailed into what I would normally do. It's kind of how I started the video. Then I had my middle section. It dovetails back to the typical just geeking out over how fascinating this thing is and these things are. And there were legendary magical kerises from history, kind of like Excalibur. In the old days, people thought, okay, it was a sword and it was magical. Same thing. So there was one, for instance, called, I'm going to mispronounce this, I'm sure, Setan Kober, Setankober. But anyway, the name translates as the Devil of the Grave. Well, that's going to be pretty hard to beat as a legendary weapon name. So called because a malevolent spirit got into the blade during the making of process, and then the blade went on in its career to cause all kinds of mischief. And reinforcing for us that these things were partly supernatural, and creating one was a supernatural process, again, in part. And by the way, in this picture we can see how the waves are put in when present. You basically take the blade that you're working on. Once it's taken enough shape, you turn it sideways and just pound those waves into it, bending the blade over and over as you progressively work your way up it, one direction then another. And back to the cultural stuff overall, it seems like you really just can't exaggerate how important these things were from a non-martial arts, non-utilitarian aspect. But as martial arts nerds, and especially Western martial arts nerds, we just want to think about this kind of thing. And we can slip into trying to interpret everything about the object through that lens. Do the curves make the blade easier to pull out of a victim so they don't get caught on the clothing? That's one of the theories. There's even more that I'm not mentioning. But anyway, overall, I think you get my point. We can actually miss what these things were to the people who made and used them. I focused earlier on the magical, supernatural aspects because I'm fascinated by that kind of folkloric thing. Heck, I put out 3 books on folklore mythology, but it's not just that. I mean, these are just so culturally important overall. That's why UNESCO gave them that designation that we talked about. I'm very much the wrong guy to try to explain which of the following customs are honored in which cultures in Southeast Asia, but in different places, they're worn at like every special occasion, like in this picture here, and the next one. They were worn by the groom in weddings. They're commissioned for important life events, like a boy becoming a man or getting married, speaking of marriage. Even purchasing your first property. So let's say that young man, that theoretical young man, went from boy to man, and then later is getting married and moving into his, his first real place. Okay, now let's commission the making of one of these to ensure, I'm guessing here, right? But, prosperity and safety in that home. They're passed down as, treasured heirlooms from generation to generation. I remember when we said these weren't just weapons, but they were almost like a part magic wand, part lamp, as in, the lamp that holds the spirit within it. Well, it's kind of also like the cross or rosary that you get at confirmation if you're Catholic. Man, the crazy thing is we could just keep going and keep adding layers to the metaphor. Like, that's how important these were. And anyway, this is the kind of thing that I think you can't leave out. And it's not that I think you have to do this for every ethnographic weapon type either. Like, I love the Navaja. Oh, here's back to the one that I got to see, the Kris. The Navaja, my ancestors from Spain. Okay, that's great. It was an important kind of cultural pride symbol, but to talk about them, yeah, they're a knife, and they would cut each other up with it. You don't have to deep dive on culture to talk about them on a martial arts channel. I'm going to start wrapping up here, really. Watching Matt's videos, going back and watching them because I was finally going to make a Kris video, that just kind of got the ball rolling, and I'm really responding again to almost, not all, but almost all outsider videos about the Kris. He, meanwhile, and this is just true, is my favorite YouTube weapons creator. I think he's the best out there. I have always been meaning to make a video, and I'm sure it'll end up being videos about the Kris. One of the coolest looking and I think most interesting weapons in world history. And there's so much to talk about. I mean, there's things I left out. Seriously, like the fact that this part here, see those notches on the far-flung part of the ganja? That those are presumably for catching an opponent's blade if it slides down. But then there are symbols like the one we just saw on the other side of the blade. The different forms that the hilt can take on. Things like that don't serve a fighting purpose that we're not going to get into. How the larger ones were used in war. Matt covered that. He's already got it. And the fighting considerations of the pistol grip handle in some intricacy. So if you watch all his videos, that wherever he picks up one of these, then he's got that covered. Which I guess means I've come full circle. So, thanks for watching.